Hello everybody, Jake your resident content cowboy here, Yeehaw, and this is the final tier list that you are going to see until the new meta drops in Pocket. This is everything in Shining Revelry, the best things in Ranked, and what performs very, very well in tournaments. We are going to start with decks that you just don't see, and for those, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on a lot of these cards. Then we'll move through the rest of our tiers, our S tier, A tier, B tier, C tier, D tier, and I'll tell you exactly why things are the way they are. Yes, we still got the B tier, which is devastating, but let's talk about some decks that you just don't see to start this video out. There are a lot of EX Pokemon that are just not super relevant in the current meta, and I'm excited to see what new cards will change with things, right? Obviously, every time there is a new set, new trainer cards, new supporters, and things like that can make something old relevant again. But here are a lot of cards that you just don't see too much. Venusaur EX just isn't seen that much from a lot of the grass decks. You're more often seeing things like Exeggutor, Meowscarada. You don't see much Arcanine. You don't see much of the old Pikachu EX or the old Gengar EX. We don't see any really of the Marowak EX. We don't see many Weezing decks. I think some people are trying to play it a bit with Clodsire, but it's just not super popular. Old Wigglytuff, Yanmega EX, these decks don't see a ton of play either. Pachirisu, maybe once we get more tools, we might see more of it, but right now Pachirisu is not really there. Lapras EX, Cresselia EX, these two cards are tough. Cresselia has some, moments with Giratina, but even then, it feels pretty rough. Licky Licky EX is a card you just don't see much of, especially because it is 4 energy to attack. Another card, a new card that you don't see a lot of, Barrel EX. Almost the same situation as Licky Licky, right? A stage 1 requires 4 energy, only does 100 damage, just seems like not enough. Some people have tried this deck with Manaphy and Irida and things like that, but it really doesn't have any legs in the current meta. And finally, Starmie EX is just a card you don't see too much anymore, really after Cyrus became such a staple in almost every deck in the meta. Starmie lost a lot of value. Its 0 retreat cost just means it could run back to the bench and you can grab it with Cyrus. Now that we've talked about a lot of decks you don't see, and I'm not going to get every deck in this video, let's move into some decks that you do see in our D tier, aka our Dragonite tier. These are decks that don't really crush it, but they're kind of fun. Alright, let's start with a deck I showcased on the channel recently, and that is Tinkaton EX. I actually really enjoyed climbing with Tinkaton EX, and I think we were positive win rate wise with it. I think we were maybe close to 55-60% with it as we were climbing through Ultra with it. I like this card a lot. I like this deck a lot. If you miss a turn with it, right? If you miss your stage 1 or miss your stage 2, or you just power your energy off 1 turn, you are pretty much cooked in this meta. I would say this is a fun, but not super competitive deck. Our next deck that we can talk about here in our D tier is Lucario EX. I think once fighting gets some type of ramp, Lucario EX could be really viable, but right now Lucario EX requires 3 energy to do 100 damage, which isn't terrible, and some damage to the bench. The only problem is it just doesn't do enough outside of that with some of the other brutally strong cards in the meta, and Lucario EX is in a weird spot because fighting decks are already great without EX Pokemon, and we'll talk about some more of them as we go through our tier list. Some other cards in the D tier that I wanted to touch on really quick without going too much into them would be something like Garchomp EX, Machamp EX, maybe one of the Golem decks would be something that you could take a look at. I think all of these decks are okay, and I'm sure there are some decent combinations with them, but they don't really win in this current meta, and that is just because a lot of what they're running into takes them out in 1 hit, and anything that's a stage 2 is tricky to get online. You have got to be incredibly good if you are a stage 2 card. Some other decks that are hanging out in our D tier are things like a Melmetal deck, a Bastiodon Skarmory deck. Dialga, interestingly enough, doesn't really have a super strong place in the current meta. And I think the big reason that you don't see as much Dialga anymore is it requires you to put energy on it for 2 turns before you start to ramp anything on your bench and charge it up. At the same time, you have to attack for it, so if it's running into any type of wall like a Druddigon or something with a Rocky Helmet, you are hurting yourself when you are powering things up, and with its HP pool, you now put yourself in this unfortunate position where things with red can KO you in a single hit. So Dialga, once again, not super relevant in the meta. Maybe we could rename the D tier the Dialga tier, but it's still the Dragonite tier. However, I want to talk about Dragonite later. Other decks that have some cool moments but aren't super consistent are things like old Garchomp, not Garchomp EX, and Togekiss. Togekiss actually does a decent amount of damage, and you can make some pretty fun Togekiss decks, and it pairs decently well with something like Giratina. All these decks are decent. And then there's Clodsire. Clodsire is unfortunately not great. It doesn't do a lot of damage. Poisoning something is tricky because the second they retreat, they're able to take that off of them. You could pair it with new Ekans into Arbok so that you counter something and keep it in, but there are a lot of steps involved in this Pokemon just not outputting that much damage. I wish it wasn't the case because I was actually excited about Clodsire maybe more than most decks for this new format, but it just doesn't seem like it really does enough right now. Let's move on to our C tier. These decks are pretty good, but they're not as consistent as some of our top performers. Articuno 18 Trainer is still very much a deck, and it's one of those win fast, lose fast decks, so you can move through grinding ranked very quickly. You do not need over a 50% win rate to hit Master Ball, so some people are running things like this. We also have Primeape decks that are making their way back into the meta. Something with Primeape and Aerodactyl has been very fun, where people are just running that promo Mankey right into Primeape Aerodactyl on their bench, which is a pretty cool setup. It's not the most consistent deck, but it actually does pretty well. We then have Blaine, and here is a look at just a version of a Blaine that works pretty well. Blaine is now running not only, of course, Blaine, but also red in this meta, so you're able to do more damage to your opponent's EX Pokemon. Blaine is not it right now, but it sets up pretty fast, and you can still take down some decks that don't happen to get themselves set up super quick. There are a few versions of Celebi that are doing okay in this current meta, but it's definitely not a superstar. Celebi Executor seems to be the most powerful deck still, and the reason for that, the most powerful Celebi deck, I should say, not the most powerful deck in the meta. The reason for that is Grass is still very strong into things like Darkrai, which you see a ton of. Executor does a huge amount of damage for only one energy, and then you can power Celebi on your bench. You also get to heal with things like Erica, run Giant Capes, and Rocky Helms. It's not terrible, and it's decently consistent, especially when you see so many Darkrai's. Infernape has had kind of a weird place in the meta for a while now. My personal favorite variant is Infernape Arceus Heatran, but I don't think Infernape is a stellar card in the set. It does decent damage, and paired with things like Geo or Red, it can one-shot a lot of what you're looking at on the other side as far as the meta is concerned, but it being a stage 2 can be a little tricky. There's also an Infernape Giratina setup that's pretty fun, but in general, Infernape is just kind of in this like, tier. Once it gets online, it's pretty dang solid, but it bricks just like any stage 2 bricks. Next is Weavile, specifically Weavile Darkrai. This deck is okay, and it's mainly because you run into a lot of psychic things out there, right? Giratina, this deck is just dominated. Giratina Mewtwo is just ripped apart by Darkrai Weavile. There are a lot of situations where this deck is just not as good as running Darkrai Giratina, so I think you see it less and less, but it's definitely powerful. Running cards like Dawn allows you to set up some really strong one-turn KOs. In general, though, this deck hangs out in our C tier. It's good, but not great. This next one might be a little controversial, but it's Gallade. I think Gallade is actually closer to a C tier than a B tier for me. I don't think this is a top deck. However, it is not bad at all. I just think, yes, once it gets set up, it does pretty decent damage, but I don't think it performs that well into too much of the meta. I know for a little while it seemed to be replacing Lucario Rampardos, but I actually greatly prefer Lucario Rampardos to Gallade. This might just be my personal preference, however. I do think Gallade can have some pretty strong matchups, especially considering it does more damage the more energy your opponents have on them, and you see so many cards that love to sit in the back line and stack up tons of energy. by the time they get out, Gallade can snap them up. Our next C tier card is going to be Miss Magius. I think Miss Magius is okay, but this just feels like a weaker version of other Giratina decks that you might see out there. You'll have some fun matches with it. You'll also have matches where you are shocked that you are not confusing your opponents. They simply will not flip what you need them to flip. So in general, I think this is a fun card, but also just not super consistent. Beedrill EX is hanging out here in our C tier just as Beedrill by itself, which is a really fun troll deck. I actually think there is a Beedrill deck that is very, very good and a meta contender. This is just kind of Beedrill by itself. Really fun. You could definitely climb with it, but let's face it, it's kind of cheesy. Well, I don't even know why I said kind of cheesy. It's extremely cheesy. It's Kraft Mac and Cheesy over here. Next, let's talk about Wugtrio. Wugtrio is actually not that bad. Everything hanging out in our C tier is not that bad, and Wugtrio, I feel like I'm winning a lot more than I'm losing with it. Once you get it online, you could have some crazy fun games because of it. I don't think it's the best. You are relying so much on the RNG gods blessing you to allow this card to really do something, but I mean, I gotta give it up to it. It's a great time, and honestly, when I run into a Wugtrio on the other side, I'm rooting for them because it's cool when things go well for this deck. Next is Pikachu EX. This is the new Pikachu EX, and I have a deck highlighted on my channel talking about this kind of right when the set dropped. I was really excited about this card. It plays pretty well into a lot of the meta because 150 damage for 3 energy is very solid. Even if your opponent's Giratina is running Cape, Red will KO this in a single hit. I've had my best success with this new Pikachu and a Magnezone combo. Obviously, you can power Magnezone by itself. You can power Pikachu by itself. You can use something like the new Pachirisu card to charge up Pikachu or the Magnezone on the bench and do some decent damage. The big problem, I think, with this is Pikachu's HP pool is really, really small, which means once it gets in, it is most likely going down in one hit. Next in our C tier is Palkia. Palkia and Pikachu, I would say, are both kind of close to coming into the B tier for me. I do think this is still a pretty decent card, and you could run kind of the classic Palkia, Origin Form Palkia Manaphy deck and do pretty well. However, considering it only has 150 HP, it is really losing out to a card like Gyarados right now, which we'll talk about later. Gyarados is one of the better cards in the meta, and Palkia just isn't there. It's susceptible to red. It takes a little while to power up. And I think because of that, you just run into situations where Palkia is not as viable as some of your other water options. Next, I want to just briefly touch on a few decks that I don't see a ton of, but I do think are powerful. Some different Executor variants. We talked about Celebi a little earlier, but you could see things like Executor Leafeon do decently well. Executor is just still a very, very powerful grass card that you can put with a lot of decks. Leafeon, I do think, has some moments where it shines, but other than that, maybe I could even put this in the D tier if I'm being honest. I think Leafeon is just a little too underwhelming when it comes to damage. I think Glaceon is the same way. I like Glaceon a lot, but unfortunately, I just think Glaceon does not output enough damage for the energy required for it to be super meta. And the other decks that we don't see a ton of in the meta right now are berry decks using Snorlax, and I wonder if people are just a little off that, or if the decks just don't perform that well currently because of Giratina and Darkrai. That being said, I do think Berry is still decent. Now let's move into our B tier. Still got the B tier. These are very solid meta contenders. What we are looking at first is going to be a Blastoise deck. This particular Blastoise deck did well in a recent tournament, getting pretty deep. The thing about Blastoise is it does require a lot of setup, but it has enough HP to survive a hit from Giratina, and if you have the proper amount of energy on it, it can sweep the entire enemy team. It's not as consistent as Gyarados, who is higher on our tier list, but I do think Blastoise has its place. Next, we're going to take a look at Greninja, and in general, there are multiple Greninja variants that are still doing pretty well. Darkrai Druddigon Greninja is still a pretty fun deck that you can have some decent results with. Anything that allows Greninja to get set up and chip from the bench is pretty powerful, and I've also seen this deck run with things like Giratina EX, so I do think Greninja still has a decent spot in this meta. That's why I'm putting it in the B tier. Next in our B tier is Lucario Rampardos. This deck is extremely good. One of my favorites to play. I love Lucario Rampardos. Things like Sudowoodo, Lucario, non-EX Lucario, Rampardos, they all combo really well together to output insane amount of damage very quickly. I said insane amount of damage very quickly onto things like Darkrai and Giratina, which you see most games. Next in our B tier is going to be Skarmory Magnezone. I like multiple variations of Skarmory, but Skarmory Magnezone is the strongest in the meta right now. Very aggressive with Skarmory while you set up Magnezone on your bench. That level of aggression will take a deck like Darkrai Giratina by surprise sometimes and allow you to set up big plays with Cyrus later. You get a little lucky and you're able to get your Magnezone online soon enough, and you can wipe the floor with something that has 140, even to 170 HP. Next is Arceus Carnivine. This is a really cool deck, and it actually does very well in this meta. Carnivine slaps for 50 damage once Arceus is in play, and once you are doing that, if you have a dark type on the other side like Darkrai, you're hitting for 70. If you have an item on this, you're making sure your opponents have to deal with this and take this down. It can take down Druddigons in a couple of hits. All the while you can power up Arceus, which still does a considerable amount of damage. This is really the only deck that Arceus shines in right now, but it's pretty solid into this meta. Our next deck is going to be Dragonite, and I cannot believe I'm saying it, but yes, I think Dragonite is a very solid deck in this meta, and that's why it is close to the top here in our B tier. Dragonite plays very well into another deck that wants to stall and set up. So just like the Giratina Darkrai decks that you're running into, or the Giratina Mewtwo decks that you're running into, Dragonite Giratina sets up on the bench with Druddigon in that active spot, and it actually gives you enough time to find the energy you need from Dragonite. Then once it goes out, if you're able to swing with Dragonite 2 times in a game, you are almost always going to be winning that match. It also only gives up 1 point. I was a bit of a doubter on this deck, but I have to say, I gave my ukulele apology. I'm a believer. Dragonite Giratina EX is very good. Our final B tier deck is Mewtwo Giratina. So this is a very powerful EX deck, but it does seem to be slipping quite a bit. It sort of had its day in the sun, and now I do think a lot of the stronger decks are playing pretty well into it. I think this deck is strong. As many of you know, it's considered the hardest deck to pilot in all of Pokemon Pocket. So if you want your pilot's license, I would play something like this Mewtwo Giratina. But remember, you have to shower twice as often as as Giratina Darkrai. I don't know why, but you do. All right, now I want to talk about our S tier and our A tier together, if you will. In fact, I want to skip over our A tier for a second and just start talking about our S tier, because I think every deck in the A tier exists because of our S tier. And I hope that'll make sense here in a sec. So what we're looking at here is the S tier. This is Darkrai Giratina. And what I like to show, I'll show you a couple different variations of Darkrai Giratina, but it has Darkrai, Giratina, and a bunch of other nonsense in there. You know, you've got all the trainers, everything you need to mess with your opponents. These are basic Pokemon that set up in tandem, where you are using Giratina's ability to generate energy while you are putting energy on Darkrai and chipping at your opponents. You are then deciding when you're going to move in with one of the two that has a cape or a Rocky Helm, and you're throwing red at your opponent's EX Pokemon. It is the meta. It is pretty gross. It is pretty dang hard to beat, and there is no question it is the best deck in the game. If you want the simplest thing to climb to Master Rank, but you won't be able to brag about it to your friends, it is Darkrai Giratina. It is the meta. Everything else in the game has to react to this in some way, because if me playing on stream is any indicator, you will run into this deck over and over and over again on your climb through rank. So now let's talk about kind of my favorite tier, maybe. I don't know, B tier is pretty close. Can't believe I'm saying that, but it is the A tier. These are great counters and top decks. In our A tier, we have Gyarados, Charizard, and Meowscarada variants. I think there are some really solid decks right here, and there are a lot of very good ones in the B tier as well that perform pretty well into the meta. These decks, however, have some very strong counters to the meta that I think make them particularly good. Let's start with Gyarados. Gyarados is so incredibly powerful, not only because of Gyarados EX, which I'll talk about in a sec, but because water decks have so many good cards that help them succeed. Manaphy is incredible for powering up. Origin Form Palkia is a great single point card to give your opponents that also swings for a ton of damage. Irida, Misty, there are just so many good options. But let's talk specifically about Gyarados EX. Gyarados EX is so incredibly good because of its HP pool. 180 HP with 140 attack damage on its Rampaging Whirlpool. Not only that, you have the opportunity to remove energy from your opponents, and things like Giratina EX can have a very difficult time getting psychic energy back on it when they are in the Darkrai Giratina deck, because that is only running dark energy. So it's a really strong counter in many ways. You pair this with red and it's a one-hit KO into almost anything on the other side that's an EX Pokemon. Gary is incredible. You also can put a Rocky Helmet on something like Gyarados. That way, even if you don't get the KO in one, they are left with such little HP that for them to attack you means they go down and you don't. Gyarados is one of the best cards in the game right now, and it is because of how good it plays into this meta. Next is Charizard EX. Not the new Charizard EX, even though there is room for the new Charizard in a deck like this. So I'll show one version kind of with the old Char and one version with the old and new Char in it. The old Charizard EX is amazing. Crimson Storm is the best move in the game, essentially. 200 damage to the active spot. It is a guaranteed KO on essentially anything in the roster outside of like Bastiodon flipping heads. But outside of that, it is a guaranteed KO on anything in the roster. Giratina, Darkrai, it doesn't matter what cape they have or anything like that. It doesn't matter how much they plan on healing next turn. You will one-shot these cards, and it is why Charizard is so incredibly good. My personal favorite build for Char right now is the Charizard with Shaman, but I do think there is some cool stuff with using one of each of the Charizard EXs. However, I've personally found that old Charizard is just stronger in almost every sense. It can't generate its own energy, but outside of that, it's not there to do that. Moltres is there for the energy generation. This is just there to sweep the entire enemy team up once it has its energy. And because not everything in the meta can guarantee a one-hit KO on Darkrai Giratina, Charizard is very much in the A tier for me. And finally, in our A tier, we have Meowscarada. Such a superstar in Shining Revelry. Meowscarada has a few variants that are really powerful. I personally like Meowscarada Beedrill or Meowscarada Magnezone. Both of them play very well into everything that you are seeing on the other side of the board. It destroys every EX it runs into with crazy power from Meowscarada, and then depending on which version you play, you have kind of two different strategies, right? With the Magnezone deck, you're using Meowscarada to do a ton of damage, while Sprigatito early is pulling all of your grass cards, and then with the Beedrill deck, you are dealing a lot of damage with either Beedrill or Meowscarada, but again using Sprigatito to find all your cards. Once you have your setups for these two decks, it's either Meow is swinging or Beedrill is swinging. And then in the Meow Magnezone deck, you are letting Meow swing and do a ton of damage while you are waiting to power up Magnezone. Magnezone able to power itself up, Meowscarada only needing 2 energy. And then on the other side, both Beedrill and Meowscarada requiring such little energy that it's easy for you to pivot between either of these and do crazy damage to your opponents. Meowscarada is great. Also, of course, Darkrai is weak to grass, which is amazing. This just makes it so easy for you to deal with a lot of those crazy meta decks. Either one of these are a very strong choice to climb right now. Now, I'm sure there are some of your favorite decks that I have missed, so please let me know your favorites down in the comments. I'm just trying to give you a good idea of what I think Shining Revelry has been like for this game. Enjoy your climb to Master Rank. Remember, if you do it with Darkrai Giratina, it's not that you didn't get to Master Rank, it's just that you're not allowed to brag about it. So, do with that what you will. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, I love you guys, I'll see y'all next time. We did it. We did it.